This is this week's version of the Line podcast with Jen Gerson and Matt Gurney.
We're going to spend some time today looking at each other, wondering why the hell Melanie Joly is saying the strange things she's doing about Israel, Hamas, Gaza. We're going to take a look at escalation at home, some pretty horrifying anti-Semitic acts this week. And we're also going to talk about a new federal report that leaves both Jen and I nervous. All that and more on the latest episode of the Line podcast. Melanie Joly.
Tell me what Melanie Joly had to say today.
I don't want to tell you what Melanie Joly had to say today. I think it technically was yesterday. She was returning from some summit, the G7, I think. And I read you the full answer she gave reporters, and I read it in the Star. And
Firstly, we should probably explain for people who maybe don't know, Melanie Joly, what exactly is she?
She's the Foreign Affairs Minister.
Our Foreign Affairs Minister. Thank you.
Which was sort of a baffling career resurrection. Melanie Joly, if I recall correctly, early in her career, had a junior portfolio, Canadian Heritage, I think it was, and did not excel in it, and then was sort of punted out of view for a while, and ended up kind of making a surprise return to the spotlight with one of, in fact, the most prominent jobs in the Canadian cabinet, which sort of left a lot of people scratching their heads. My speculation at the time was that this was actually Justin Trudeau designating a preferred successor. Melanie Joly and Justin Trudeau are kind of from the same branch of the current federal Liberal Party, both Quebecers, both on the hopey, changey, sunny ways, progressive part of it. But who cares? What she actually said when she got back from the summit, she was obviously asked about Canada's position on the fighting, and she gave an answer that I think made perfect sense. And the start of the answer was, we and our allies support humanitarian pauses to allow humanitarian supplies to be delivered to Gaza. Jen and I both support that. To allow the evacuation of hostages if possible. Well, we obviously support that. And to possibly allow chances for dialogue. And okay, I think that's unlikely at this time. But in general, I'm okay with the humanitarian pause so long as it is short and tactical to achieve a certain objective, to allow aid to reach Gazans, to get hostages out, also foreign citizens, including Canadians, get them out. But then she kept going, and
just read it out. Read exactly what she said. I want you to read exactly what she said.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, watching this on YouTube, you'll have to indulge me a minute. I'm going to have to move from one tab to another. But Jen, here is exactly, and I know it looks like I'm staring off into space here, but this is the exact quote. So let me read the part that you and I both agreed with. You know, we're all in favor of that one day there will be a ceasefire. That's what President Macron of France said. But what France has said is that currently we're at the stage of calling for a humanitarian pause, because speaking concretely, we must evacuate Canadians. We have to ensure hostages are freed. We have to assure more humanitarian aid gets into Gaza. That's the part where Jen and I were like 100% will endorse that. Sure. High five.
Yep. Cool.
Then she said, hopefully will lead to a form of détente. That's summarized by the Star. But then the quote begins again. And so allow, I hope, even more negotiations at a negotiating table where there are Israelis, Hamas, and Qatar, which is present as a moderator. Hamas. Okay, now I'm going to start looking properly into the camera again because I've closed the tab.
Yep. Yeah. And also you need to make this point emphatically.
Well, I used a word before we started the podcast that you have instructed me not to use during the podcast.
Yeah, so, we don't need to get canceled for the stupid reasons.
No, and people know the words we use here. So the word I was going to use was even worse than that. But my reaction to the comments, and by the way, it was not a slur against Melanie Joly. It was a reaction to the comments. Here is the sanitized version. What the fuck? That's the nice version. Hamas does not want to be at a bargaining table, and we don't want them at a bargaining table because they don't mean it. And it was Hillary Clinton, of all people, this week, who went on like The View or something, one of the daytime talk shows, and she was pointing out you can't trust Hamas because what people demanding a ceasefire conveniently forget is that on October 6th, there was a ceasefire and Hamas broke it so that they could carry out their rape pogrom.
So here's a point that before we get into the ceasefire stuff, there's just a point I'd like to make, and that is we really have to stop ignoring the words that Hamas uses and the things that they are literally continually going on television to threaten. They have literally said, we're not interested in a ceasefire. If you stop the military actions, we're going to continue to murder Israelis. They have literally said, it's really unfortunate about all the Gaza citizens that are dying. Unfortunately, that's just a necessary sacrifice that we're willing to accept in pursuit of our goals, which is the wiping out of the Jews from Israel. They have literally been challenged by Saudi reporters on many of these factors who have asked them, well, you know what, you spent all of your aid money on highly elaborate, tactically useful tunnels underneath Hamas. Why did you not put some of that money aside for bomb shelters? And Hamas spokespersons have said it's basically not our responsibility to take care of our citizens. It's the UN's responsibility to take care of our citizens. It's the NGO's responsibility to take care of our citizens. We accept the death of our citizens en masse as a necessary sacrifice in the pursuit of our strategic ends. They have put this in that is their starting position. And if you want to have a ceasefire has a very specific set of meanings, and it requires both parties to agree to those terms, not just the Israelis. It also requires Hamas to agree to stop engaging in terrorism in the pursuit of a negotiated settlement of some kind with Israelis. Hamas is not interested in a two-party state. We've made this point equally before. Their literal raison d'etre, their charter explicitly states that their goal is to kill all the Jews, push them into the sea, and take over all of Israel. That is their goal. They are not interested in pursuing a peaceful two-state solution. They want to create an Islamic state. They want to recreate IS. They looked at what IS did in Iraq and said, yes, that. Okay? That's their position. And if you want to defend these groups because you are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause or sympathetic to Palestinians in the abstract, I mean, I can follow you into sympathy with Palestinians. I can't follow you into sympathy with Hamas. And I can't follow you into a place where we treat Hamas as a legitimate actor in this whom we need to negotiate with.
Podcast listeners,
that's where you lose me on this.
The Line podcast listeners will never have the pleasure of having seen the war against my own raging emotions has been playing out on my face over the last couple of minutes.
Have I explained this position as clearly and emphatically as I'm capable of doing so?
I think. Look, what I would add is that how many variations of the truism or the cliche or whatever you want to call it have you heard that basically boils down to when someone shows you who they are, believe them? Or there's the other one, actions speak louder than words. So if someone is saying one thing but behaving in another way, you believe the actions, not the word. You know, I know I'm drifting into drill the Twitter account territory here with where he said you got to hand it to ISIS, and then he had that, it was the famous joke, right? Like the correction. In fact, you do not need to hand it to ISIS. But I'm going to risk having one of those moments of infamy there, and I'm going to give Hamas this slightest bit of credit. They are internally consistent.
Oh yes,
their words and their actions align.
Yes,
and you know,
they are morally clear in their pursuit of their strategic objectives.
They leave little room for ambiguity, or confusion or doubt. The first 2/3 of Melanie Joly's statement made perfect sense, and I think we here at The Line would sign on to that without equivocation. We would endorse that immediately. Better chance to get hostages out, better chance to get Canadians out, more humanitarian aid to Gazans who are suffering.
And also, let's give a humanitarian pause. Also, might get more opportunities for Gazan civilians to get out of the line of fire
through the safe corridors. Right? Yeah,
great. Yes, on board with that.
But the idea.
Imagine for a moment that like 3 weeks after 9/11, The Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister was like, we
We got
really
to
need to
get
get Al Qaeda
in
to
Geneva.
the negotiating
Yeah.
table. Like
Yeah.
stop and think that one through. Like,
You know,
we're really concerned about the escalation of violence in Afghanistan. It's time to get
or
Bin
lower
Laden.
Manhattan.
Yeah, exactly. It's time to get Bin Laden at the negotiating table
and hammer out a deal.
And hammer out a deal.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's what these people are fucking calling for. I can't.
I don't. And I think with Melanie Joly,
so where do we go with that?
No, here's where I'm going to go with it.
Okay.
I saw one person, smart, well-meaning, heart in the right place, say that almost all wars end in ceasefires. And those ceasefires lead to an opportunity to have negotiations. And that's correct. That is true.
Yep.
But almost is not all. Some wars have to end with the complete destruction of the enemy's military infrastructure and the occupation of their territory.
Yep.
And I've been having interesting conversations this week. I think one of the things some people are struggling with right now, and I'm going to say I should have like a sign made or maybe a graphic we can flash on the screen, but our expectations are a problem, right? Because I think there are certain people out there who expect Hamas will be like the ethnic groups that were warring after Yugoslavia collapsed, or the Irish Republican Army, where there's an opportunity here to actually, after some horrific bloodletting, to have a conversation about what is the final status going to be, what are the borders, what are the jurisdictions going to be. But if your expectations are a negotiated peace with Hamas along those lines,
a genocidal death cult.
Yeah, your expectations
Hamas is a genocidal death cult.
There must eventually be negotiations between Israel and Palestinians along those lines.
Absolutely.
But it will not be with Hamas. Hamas has to be destroyed. And people this week it's funny sometimes where you'll tell people what you mean and they won't believe you because they disagree with you so profoundly. Maybe it's flattering in a way, but they assume either that I don't know what I said or that I'm an idiot. And people have been saying to me, but don't you know how many civilians will die when Hamas is being destroyed? And I say to them, yes. And they're like, are you prepared to accept that? And I say to them, yes. Not because I want it to happen, but because it is the only way that it will happen short of Hamas surrendering. Arguing against Hamas's military destruction is arguing against reality. Hamas must be destroyed, or at least to the point, it's possible that this conflict might get to the point where Hamas has been sufficiently degraded that what's left of it surrenders. But that's not, we're nowhere.
Est.
Someone said to me this week, so what you're saying is we shall make it desolation and call it peace? And I said, basically.
That sometimes I mean, this is also the problem that I think a lot of people run into, because very few people in our current generation have experience with, for certainly not firsthand experience with violence, and very little experience with warfare. That's often how wars end. One side wins.
Destroys the other.
It's awful. It's a terrible thing. We don't say war is bad because that's the nice thing to say. We say war is bad because it's really bad. It's the most horrible thing that humans can do to one another. And sometimes it's the only way forward. Sometimes the only option here is that one side needs to win, because otherwise you wind up in these periods of perpetual cycles of violence, right? Where essentially, okay, so there's a ceasefire, Hamas's military capacities aren't totally destroyed, they continue to fester, they rebuild, and in 10 years we redo this, we regain this exercise. In 20 years we redo this exercise. In 30 years we redo this exercise. You either destroy Hamas and their entire military capability, and then start from scratch renegotiating with Palestinians or whatever is left of a government arm of Palestinians to create a lasting, sustainable, peaceful solution.
Which may fail, but you've got to try.
Yeah. Or you wind up getting trapped in this cycle of violence that never ends perpetually. Or you let Hamas win. Like, the other option here is that Hamas is the winning party.
those
Pick one of these three options. They're all bad, they all suck, and they all involve lots of civilian life.
That's just not how we think, though. I mean, this
I
is
know.
the flashing graphic expectations are a problem.
Yeah, this is how Asperger's people like me think. Like,
Or anyone
emotionally
who's read a
stunted.
history book. Like, most conflicts end in a ceasefire and a negotiated peace, but not all of them, because some of them can't. Israel with Hamas does not have someone to negotiate with.
I would also argue that, like, even Afghanistan didn't end with a negotiated ceasefire and negotiated peace.
We lost.
Yeah, we lost. That's what happened.
Yeah.
We went in, we were defeated by a war of attrition, and eventually we gave up and went away. The West lost in Afghanistan. The Taliban won.
And we could afford to lose in Afghanistan because we don't live there. Israel
Correct.
Does not have that option.
Correct.
You know, I think people who are calling for a ceasefire, I understand that they mean well. I understand that they are appalled by the same footage and video. People have been asking me all week, because I wrote the column earlier week about what I saw at the Israeli consulate. People have been asking me, well, have you seen what's happening in Gaza? Yeah.
Yes.
I've seen the kid whose skull is fractured and his brains are gone.
Yep.
I've seen the kid whose leg has been blown off being carried through the rubble. I've seen the guy in the parking lot whose legs are gone. I don't like any of it, but I understand that the only way that's going to stop is when Hamas is defeated. And I hope that happens really quickly. And I think that it is so foreign to the North American experience, being stuck in an existential fight where the other guy is not looking for trade concessions or a sliver of land, but they're looking to kill you.
Realistically, we've never had an existential fight.
Not North America, no.
Not North America.
Not Canada and the United States. Some of the indigenous tribes certainly did.
Okay, that's fair. Yes, that's fair. We've participated in other people's existential fights, but we've never actually been in an existential fight. And the concept of that being a thing is completely foreign to our mentality and our experience and our lived experience.
Our military history for the last several centuries, and this is where the military history nerds will perk up, but the rest of the people, I might have to explain this a bit. Our military history is mostly expeditionary. We fight abroad. Our battles are fought on someone else's soil. And if we lose soldiers, we lose equipment, we might even lose whole units, but the country's still there. You know, when we got wiped out at Dieppe, the Dieppe raid, we lost the whole brigade in effect. Canada was fine. Like, no one missed a meal in Canada because the Dieppe raid failed. Other countries, other civilizations, other societies throughout human history, if you lose the battle, you're dead.
And I would say that this dichotomy exists for both Hamas and Israel.
Oh, no, it sure shit does now. Yeah.
Right?
The Israelis have been saying that this is a fight for Israel's survival. And North Americans go, no, it's not. Guys, you can disagree with them all you want. They think they're right. They're going to act accordingly.
I would also argue that they are, because if they wind up in this continued cycle where they mow the lawn against Hamas, but don't totally degrade Hamas's capacity to exist as a military unit, and then Hamas then rebuilds, rearms, and we just engage in this process every 15 to 20 years as young Palestinians come of age and can be recruited at a significant number. What winds up happening is that every single time we go through this cycle, Israel loses the support of the international community, and Israel loses particularly the support of Americans. And if I were Israel, the numbers that would scare the shit out of me would be the demographic breakdowns about Israeli support. So our parents sort of came of age in a time when Israel was the underdog against the much larger and superior Arab force. And so their concept of Israel was formed against this idea that they were in fact the lesser power. And then you and I came of age in this era in which Israel was overwhelmingly the military and economic superior. And then we have this new generation coming after us, coming of age when that was extremely true. And you can only see Palestinians as being this oppressed underdog. So like there's been a perceptual shift that's happened over the last 100 years. And as a result, the generation that's coming up does not support Israel, and emphatically does not support Israel. And you can operate on the assumption that will change as they get older. I remember back in the day, a lot of people in the journalism industry were very assured that, the young people would pick up newspapers as they aged. Didn't turn out happening. if I were Israel, I'd be looking at this on a 20 to 50 year time frame and thinking, okay, but I literally can't afford to keep up this fight every 10 to 15 to 20 years perpetually, because the generation that's coming up now and will be in power in 30 to 40 years from now isn't going to be there for me.
Well,
Like,
and
you can't, they can't guarantee that you're going to have the military support, the moral support, the soft power support, the hard power support. It's gone in a generation or two.
Oh, and hovering in the background of all, I agree with you 100%, but the other thing, the Iranian bomb. Like this,
right?
Israel has a fairly, or I'll put it this way, Israel believes it has a fairly narrow window of opportunity to establish security conditions that it can survive long term. Hamas was not its primary concern until about 32 days ago. It is now.
Well, yeah, and as I said, I think especially if you're looking at Hamas operating in tandem with the Iranians in any level, I seriously do believe that what's happening right now in Israel does represent an existential threat to the country and to the people there. So
imagine October 7th, where something very similar happens. There's hang gliders and there's mortars and drones and the fence gets breached. But what happens that time, instead of raiding parties there to rape, murder, and butcher and take hostages back, you've got 3 or 4 pickup trucks that burst through the border fences, put the pedal to the metal, and drive nuclear weapons in the beds of the trucks into the nearest Israeli cities and just.
And then okay, so to repeat, so October 7th, except now we escalate with a nuclear armed Iran.
Yeah.
Like the window for action for Israeli to establish a peaceful, sustainable 2-state solution here is actually really small. And if they don't take advantage of it, honestly, I think that there's a pretty good chance that they won't exist in our lifetime.
They'll lose.
They'll lose.
Yep.
That's right.
And
that's the other way that this war ends.
Yeah.
So, and what replaces Israel? I mean, this is the other problem, the idea that a lot of people said, well, from the chant from the river to the sea isn't a genocidal chant, because what we really want is like a Palestinian run Israeli state. And like the Israeli Jews will just live in the Palestinian run Israeli state. I think that is horrifically naive.
There's a whole bunch of people in southern Israel who have some questions.
Yeah. Like, I think that if you're operating under the assumption that the Palestinians, as led by a Hamas-like government, are going to live in harmony with the Israeli Jews under their, I think that's insane. I think that you're circling Mars now with that level of naivete. I think that is completely detached from Hamas's own charter, and I think it's completely detached from the realities of Jews in the Middle East. I mean, there's a reason why the Jews got run out of every Arab nation.
There's that video I showed you a few weeks ago. Someone before the UN who just said, you call us the apartheid state. Iran, where are your Jews? Iraq, where are your Jews? Libya, where are your Jews? You kind of just went down the whole list.
Yeah, there were traditional Jewish communities in virtually every modern, what is now a modern Arab state. Major, established, centuries old Jewish communities.
Thousands of years.
Right, you're right. Sorry, thousands of years old Jewish communities in all of these places that no longer exist.
But whatever could have happened to them?
What could have happened to them, Matt? Well, I think we're starting to take a look at exactly what happened to them, which is a real morbid transition. On that note, like and subscribe the Line podcast, because we're starting to
leave us a glowing review.
Leave us a glowing review.
Before we pivot, Jen, can I just we'll make the pivot now. Can I just mention something to you? I had lunch this week with someone I've been catching up with lately, and was just telling kind of like my career, like 16 years in the business now, and thinking I used to read the latest Senate report, go to the economic club luncheon where the relevant cabinet minister would deliver remarks, and write up an 800-word story talking about like telecom regulation reform, or which fighter jet we were going to procure next. Right before COVID hit, the thing I'd been writing about the most for months had been dragged out labor negotiations between the Ontario government and the teachers' unions.
Oh, so cute. There was also a time when you worked at the National Post where they'd bring a drink cart around on Fridays. It was very civilized. It was a more civilized time, Matt.
We peaked in 2019.
Oh, no, we peaked way before that. We
Depends.
peaked in like 2007.
That's actually an interesting debate to have. I think we peaked somewhere in that range because I
Okay.
think depending on what exactly you're looking at, you could call it at different times. But
The global financial crisis was the beginning of the end for everything.
yeah, I think probably there was a phase of peaking.
Mm.
I remember.
Well, these things never happen in one day, right?
No, no.
Um,
All right, let's talk about
Speaking
the
of
other.
things never happening in one day and slow escalation,
You know what, Jen?
uh,
I gotta say at the beginning here, I was wrong, and
wrong.
I'm gonna own that
Okay.
because I had told you last week on the pod, and in the dispatch that I actually felt a little bit better. I thought the protests had settled down a bit. I
Mm-hmm.
thought the risk of regional escalation had diminished because of the Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, had given a speech. I still feel a little bit better about the regional escalation dangers, but I think I was wrong that we had seen the peak of the crazy here at home. This week we had a Jewish man at a protest and a counter protest. He was murdered in Los Angeles. And in Montreal, you knew it would be Montreal. I think you and I both went on the record and predicted it would be Montreal. Not just the slurs and the screaming and the shoving at Concordia, but a Jewish community center and a synagogue in Montreal hit with Molotov cocktails. Thank God, no major damage, but arson, again, targeting cultural and religious sites, and gunshots fired into Jewish schools. No one was hurt, but we're tipping over, Jen, from
Also, Concordia has been an absolute shit show.
that's a fairly open-ended statement, but
Yes, well,
uh, we're, t-
not all academics.
we're moving from, like, we have not yet had, thank God, and God forbid, but we have not yet had something so egregiously awful happen in this country that it kind of draws a sharp line between the nonviolent phase and the violent phase. But I think we're tipping over into a phase of this thing where I'm no longer convinced that we can say that this is a nonviolent matter in this country. When you've got bullets flying into schools,
We're
Warren
in we're on the train now.
Warren Kinsella tweeted a few days ago, a columnist for the Toronto Sun. He tweeted, and he was part of the briefing that I was at the consulate on Monday, and he wrote a column in the Sun describing much the same things that I wrote about in the line. He simply tweeted that he had dinner with a friend, a Jewish friend, and the Jewish friend told him that he was planning to get a gun. I haven't really commented on this publicly yet, Jen, but I can tell you a couple things. The number of Jewish people in my life who have sought me out knowing that I'm a gun guy to help them get guns, between 5 and 10, trending upward.
Mm-hmm.
I recently broke one of my pistol magazines at the range. The spring in it broke, and I went to buy another one. And when I was at a gun store up in the 905, I noticed inventory was low.
Mm-hmm.
And I said to the owner of the store, kind of looking around, I said, "What's going on?" And he looked at me like this. And I went, "Since the attack," and he just nodded.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't good. You said it well, Jen. We're on the train, and
We're on the train. That's a leading indicator.
someone's going to get killed.
So basically, I don't know if someone's going to kill her. The thing that our friend Laura sent us a tweet this morning showing, for example, posters of Heather Reisman, a prominent, wealthy Toronto Jew. And basically there's
Indigo,
a note
I think,
saying,
right?
oh, Indigo, yes.
Yeah.
CEO of Indigo, and notes to the effect of like, Indigo is supporting, the killing of children in Gaza kind of thing. As if Heather Reisman
Yeah.
was who just happened to be a Toronto Jew, was personally responsible. Like all of your book sales are going into murder bombs. Like
Heather Reisman has deployed her F-15 squadron to the Middle East.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is the kind of, firstly, if you were to tell me that this sort of stuff would show up as frequently as it did 2 months ago, I would have been like, in Canada, come on. Like I actually would have been skeptical of that. But this has really torn the lid off of, I think, a lot of long simmering, festering problems and positions. When you start to see, for example, prominent wealthy Jews targeted individually by name for what's happening in the Middle East, we're now on the crazy train. That's effing nuts.
Okay, Jen,
and I'm sorry, that is not only defamation, it's incitement to violence against her personally. It absolutely is.
This is not aimed at you, Jen. I don't want you to feel like I'm yelling at you, but I'm going to raise my voice here briefly. And this is just going out into the collective ether. What you're talking about, targeting prominent Jewish individuals, targeting Jewish-owned businesses. Everybody, read a fucking history book.
Yes.
We've seen this before.
Yes.
None of this is new.
This is part of a very predictable historic pattern of escalation of violence against Jews. And I'm sorry, I don't care how you feel about the Palestinian conflict. You can agree with us, disagree with us. That's totally fine. There is no Toronto Jewish-run business that has anything to do with it. There is no justification. This is not a legitimate act of Palestinian resistance to go shit on Heather Reisman or to go after the Landover Cafe. Like that. This is just straightforward. This is a straightforward and entirely predictable historic cycle that we have seen again and again and again over history of anti-Semitic violence. And I think that at this point, I mean, I won't target people because I have good relationships with this person, but someone on Twitter made this comment about the Molotov cocktail thrown against the Jewish synagogue in Montreal and said something to the effect of, this is bad, and obviously this really leads to the perception that pro-Palestinian protesters are violent. And I was like, yeah, those pesky perceptions, they just keep on popping up everywhere we go. It's funny how those pesky perceptions won't go away. And this person responded, the vast majority of these people people protesting in favor of Palestine are not violent. And I'm like, that's absolutely true. They're just chanting from the river to the sea and screaming about an intifada because it's cute now. No, of course it's not the majority of the pro-Palestinian protesters who are going to be violent. It's never the majority. It's always a minority within the group that is going to escalate to violance.
Nazi
That's literally
party
always true.
Yeah, Nazi party membership topped out at about 8 million out of a 1945 era German population of about 80 million. The majority of Germans weren't Nazis. We still firebombed the country into oblivion and occupied it for generations.
The problem that we're running into is the concept of the tyranny of the minority.
Yep.
And that is there's a minority that is a fringe and has no actual power or say over a larger group or society as a whole. And there's a minority that is still a minority, but has disproportionate power over the Overton window, the discourse, whatever you want to call it, within either a larger group or within society as a whole. I mean, a lot of people criticize my piece from 2 weeks ago about how the Hamas stuff was a mask-off moment, saying, well, it's not me. I'm the left. This isn't me. I don't believe in these extremist positions.
I know. I believe you, but...
I believe you, but the problem is that, like, a minority of liberal lefties have completely hijacked your goddamn movement. And they are now also holding disproportionate power over the state of social discourse.
Yeah.
I believe that the people who buy into a lot of these ideologies is probably sub 10%, but they have an extraordinary amount of power within the society at large if they can manage to put those 10%
in the right positions. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, it's funny. I didn't know you were going to say those exact words, but like, yeah, you took them right out of my mouth. The right positions, right? I mean, every time we've heard of some coup in some banana republic somewhere, right? Like a few dozen loyal soldiers seize the radio station, the TV station, and the telephone exchange, right? Like, if you control a few key points in anything, including a society, you will have probably not total control, but you'll have disproportionate control, and a few critical people in the right places is all you need. And this is why I've told you this, Jen, so many times before. It's one of my little meta thesis of life. It only takes a few assholes to ruin a great dinner party.
Well, speaking of a dinner party, the tyranny of the minority problem was highlighted to me by, I forget the name, but he was an academic, a fairly heterodox academic, but he made this point, and that is, say you have 100 people coming to a dinner party, and 5% of them are strongly and vehemently opposed to GMOs. Well, guess what? Your dinner party menu is going to feature no GMOs, even though 95% of the people have a sane and rational position on GMOs. the tyranny, that 5% can dictate what happens and the menu options for the other 95 by virtue of their disproportionate kind of give a shit levels.
Oh, think of a more recent example. How many family events in recent years, even say the last year or two, everybody had to do a COVID test because one person was worried.
Because one person, yeah. So it doesn't matter what if the majority of the position, actually the extreme majority position might be sane, centrist, rational, whatever you want to call it. But if the 5% or the 10% gives 300% more of a give a shit about that issue and is willing to put themselves into positions of strategic power and authority, and the rest of the society or the rest of the group isn't willing to call them out or marginalize them, then you are now dictated to by the minority. The minority gets the say. And I think that is a really roundabout, bird's eye level way of talking about what we're talking about. Yes, we're perfectly aware that the majority of people who are screaming from the river to the sea don't see that self as an anti-Semitic or genocidal phrase. But a small percentage of people in those groups do. They understand exactly what they're yelling. And a percentage of those groups are going to commit and escalate violence. And if the rest of society continues to not call that out, punish it, and potentially prosecute it as the crimes that these things are. I mean, I'm not talking about free speech issue. I've got no issue with people protesting. But when we start to cross there's a line here, and when we start getting into that line into actual prosecutable criminal acts, yeah, it's always going to be a minority that commits it. But that minority can do an extraordinary amount of damage.
Think only takes a few assholes to ruin a dinner party. I think, again, flashing graphic on the screen, expectations are a problem. I don't think people understand how much the course of a civilization or a society can be changed by a few people in critical positions. Sure. I've never been a proponent of what historians would call the great man theory. I really am of the view that cultural and historical and civilizational change is a confluence of factors, that there's sort of like an inertia to history, and that the forces are not necessarily preordained, but they will push in a direction. But a few critical people in positions of power, and it doesn't have to be elected power, political power, military power. It can be cultural power, social power, religious power.
There's a lot of different kinds of power in a society.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher from Atlanta, but he put himself at a time and a place of history where he shaped a movement. And there are other examples we could look to of where small numbers of either an individual or small numbers of people were able to push history in a certain direction. You know, go to that synagogue in Montreal, go to the community center just down the street from it, go to the schools in Montreal, the Jewish schools and daycares that had gunfire, were shot at, and tell them, don't worry about it though, it's not the majority. It doesn't have to be. And I was just doing some mental math on this. I was talking earlier in the week about this with a friend, Jen, and the reason I feel very well prepared for this podcast is because a friend of mine basically made that point and said, it's not the majority of people. And I said, imagine 1 million people, just any random 1 million people. Pretend that is your civilization. You live on an island with 1 million people, and 99% of them would never dream of being violent. You've got 10,000 potentially violent people. And if 99% of those potentially violent people never tip over into violence, you've got 10 potential mass murderers on your island of 1 million people. Imagine what would happen to any city of 1 million people if it experienced 10 mass casualty incidents. You would lose your mind as a society. And I'm with you, Jen. The idea, and I know it's comforting, and I know people also give themselves absolution from feeling any responsibility over the crazy minority when they reassure themselves and others that the majority of us do not feel this way. I accept that. I believe it. But one of the reasons, Jen, that you and I have always shaken off the label of being partisan or a member of any particular tribe, because I'm not signing myself up for any movement where I have to defend myself by telling anyone, I'm not one of those guys. I'm responsible for me.
And me alone. I'm responsible for me.
And I can barely control myself. So
well, and also, and I also don't like this idea of trying to like, I don't like it when people do this to the left or to the right, and I don't like people doing this to the left, where you try to completely undermine or delegitimize an entire ideology based on the actions of a couple of wingnuts. Okay, like I am not trying to delegitimize entire leftist discourse because of the actions of some dude who throws a Molotov cocktail at a mosque. I don't think that that's accurate or fair. I do think that a lot of leftist discourse, and by extension, larger social discourse, has been disproportionately dominated by a particularly liberal strain of leftism that has become dominant in the last 6 to 7 years. Okay, that is my argument. And I think that that's a defensible argument. At the same time, like, I think that we're being naive if we don't recognize that we are on like I said, we're on a train now. Like, the anti-Semitic violence is almost certainly going to escalate and amplify from here. And we know that because that's typically what happens in history.
Right now, Jen, right now, this exact moment, there are people in Montreal who this week threw bombs at a synagogue, threw Molotov cocktails at a community center, and fired guns into Jewish schools. I don't know if it's the same people. I don't know if it's different groups. I don't know if it's one group with multiple people. I don't know any of those things. But I know that this exact moment, they have not been caught and brought to justice, and they're still out there. Does anyone think the guy who fired the gun into the Jewish school has gotten it out of his system?
Well, the other thing too is, does anybody?
Well, that was that. Remember that crazy time I fired the guy at the Jewish school? Never doing that again, but it was great.
Or that being said, do we believe that any part of this is isolated? No. This is the problem, and this is I think the other thing that differentiates this from other sort of more random acts of violence, which we've definitely seen against other religious groups before. We've absolutely seen mosques get targeted. We've seen churches get targeted. What, you know, like that. Like we do
that
see examples.
Who killed the Muslim family in London?
Absolutely, yeah. We and there was a broader social context to that violence as well, right? Like we do see isolated incidents of violence against minorities, ethnic groups, religious. What makes this different is that this is now happening in an escalatory context where we are normalizing and, for example, also not justifying, but we're normalizing and sort of undermining and saying, well, they don't really mean that, to rhetoric that is increasingly violent against Jewish people, to actions that are increasingly targeting Jewish businesses and individuals. Like you can't separate, unlike a lot of examples of sort of religious violence or people, you know, painting the swastika on a grave 3 years ago or whatever, which probably was just kids being stupid or, you know, random acts of psychos or mentally disturbed individuals who really weren't well. This is now happening in a kind of environment, in a context that will grow on and normalize and escalate and build on one another. Am I saying that in a way that makes sense? Where like when one of these acts happens and the people involved get away with it, and then you have a bunch of people sort of hemming and hawing and be like, well, you know, but that is going to prompt the next event, and that's going to prompt the next event, and that's going to prompt the next event. Yeah, in a way that I think that we haven't seen in this country in a really, really long time.
You know, it's funny. You as a rookie reporter, my beautiful and talented line colleague here, Jen Gerson, you worked the Stars radio room.
I did.
And something, the Toronto Stars radio room, and something that journalists and police and municipal officials have long understood is that when someone kills themselves on the TDC, we don't always publicize that because there's a contagion danger.
Contagion problem, yeah.
And we understand that in the abstract, where we don't talk about certain bad things because we don't want to encourage others. And we understand that on the small scale, the municipal scale. So the Toronto Star, 680 News, CP24, they don't always report on the sad, lonely person who throws himself off a bridge or in front of a subway.
Yeah.
But now we're in a global information ecosystem where that man being murdered in Los Angeles hit the Toronto group chats like that. There is no moderating effect of time and distance anymore. And just hypothetically, like God knows I'm not hoping for this, and I'm going to be neutral which way this goes. But if a synagogue or mosque is attacked anywhere in the Western world, God forbid, every community in the Western world, every Jewish community, every Muslim community, or probably both, everywhere is going to know about it effectively at the speed of light. There is no, like, once upon a time.
And one act's going to justify the next, is going to justify the next, is going to justify the next.
And also, hey, I'm the weirdo gun guy here, but I'm not blind to the problems we're getting into here. We could easily find ourselves in a situation where someone, and again, I'm being value neutral here, I don't know which side it'll be on, but I could see someone hearing a knock in the middle of the night and letting fly with their brand shiny new 12 gauge shotgun and killing the drunk neighbor who was one house off fumbling for his keys. Like, I think one of the things I was saying earlier in the week, Jen, is that when the guardrails collapse, like, we're going right back to, is it Yates or Yeats? I never know how to pronounce the friggin' poet's name.
Yeats.
But the center doesn't hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the earth. You know, we all have our favorite lines from that poem, I guess, but the one that is always stuck with me is mere anarchy is loosed. When the center doesn't hold, things fall apart.
And that's why guardrails, due process, and all of these concepts are so important. And it's also why it's so important for the police to take these things seriously and to ensure all of these communities, regardless of anything, I'm saying all of these communities need to feel supported, respected, and listened to. And also they need to understand that they're being watched, detected.
Yeah.
Nothing, they're not going to get away with nobody, and I'm the value neutral. Nobody's going to get away with acts of unsolicited violence against other religious
or terrorism or intimidation
or anything. And on that note, I think that brings us to our last issue, like and subscribe the line, because we're increasingly nervous about the police's capacity to do exactly that.
Couple of points that I would make before I get to the week's news is that a couple of times, look, I think all of us have had this experience. So Jen, my family and I, we went out for dinner last night. The restaurant didn't have staff. How many versions of that have you seen where there's just no staff at businesses, services? I mean, the healthcare system is the big example of this. Police forces all over the country are badly understrength.
Yep.
I had, and I have to be careful when I said this because this was a series of private conversations, but I was at a bar after an event, and someone had given a talk, and a few of us retired to the bar, and I found myself at a table. It was a big mixed crowd, so a lot of, like, we had name tags, people are introducing themselves, and I found myself talking with a bunch of cops, and the one thing all the cops were talking about, and they represented different forces, was being badly understrength. Not enough officers on duty, not enough forces on the books to handle daily normal routine operations. There's a report this week that came from, I struggle to pronounce this, NSICOP, the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, I think, like NSICOP, whatever.
NSICOP, I think, is the go-to.
It's a stupid acronym, but
initially
they have a report out about the RCMP, that the RCMP is currently not able to properly perform its national security functions. The RCMP is a weird beast. And for anyone who doesn't know this, the RCMP is our federal police force. It is tasked with high-level federal responsibilities. That includes counterterrorism, counterintelligence, security for high-ranking federal officials or foreign diplomats on our soil, security of purely federal sites, embassies, diplomatic things, parts of parliament, blah, blah, blah. But because of the nature of the RCMP, the exact same police force is also writing speeding tickets in New Brunswick and busting up bar fights in rural Saskatchewan. It does not make sense to run a police force this way. And because it is what it is, you need officers in local communities for those horrific domestic violence calls, for the drunk driver, for the speed trap that brings in local revenue. The RCMP does not have the budget, the personnel, or I would even say the bureaucratic and leadership bandwidth to do all that we have tasked it with doing. And NSICOP is warning in a blunt report that it cannot discharge its national security functions properly.
Well, and I would further that and say, like, we know that actually the RCMP has been horrifically underfunded and unable to deal with white collar crime for years, to the extent that Canada is actually, in terms of the Western world, we're one of the capitals of white collar crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, money laundering and tax evasion.
Yeah, money laundering and tax evasion. There's a reason why Vancouver is what it is today.
Yeah, because the resources go to like bar fights and domestic violence, national security, white collar crime. Like it's the hierarchy of needs here, right? Like,
the capacity to deal with these things just doesn't exist. So now we're starting to see that lack of capacity bleed into other more crucial areas.
So to all of our beloved Line podcast listeners and viewers, and as Jen says, like and subscribe, leave us a glowing review, tell all your friends about us. Think of what we've been talking about for the last 15 minutes, 20 minutes perhaps, and then recall that the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians has said this week that we do not have at the federal level an effective national security agency.
Cool. Everything's fine. It's fine.
We're sitting ducks. Think of the last few years. COVID is ripping through Europe and the Middle East. It's in Seattle. It's in New York. Canadians, in their infinite wisdom, are already stripping every Costco bare of toilet paper. And the official line of the federal government was that the risk is low. Think of the convoy. The Ottawa police being given repeated warnings from OPP intelligence that these guys are coming and they're here to stay. And the Ottawa police planned for a 2-day protest. And as the POEC documents that I wrote a column about documented, within minutes of the convoy actually arriving in Ottawa, the OPP Incident Command Headquarters descended into screaming matches. Think of everything I wrote about in the columns when the POEC report came out of federal officials within our government were stumbling around, being informed, reading my fucking columns, because there was no effective sharing of national security information about the defense and security of the national capital within the federal government, and that people within the federal government did not know who they were allowed to talk to. Think about what we've learned with China electoral interference, where critical, time-sensitive national security information is dumped into an undifferentiated binder, which is then available for federal officials to come read.
Ignore.
Or also to ignore, right? And that it is not prioritized in any way, and there was no one present to provide any kind of real-time assessment or analysis.
Yeah.
Here's the binder. Read it. And you have to do it at our facility because there's no provision to get you briefed. Think about Marco Mendocino, the late and unmissed public safety minister. Well, he's not dead, but he's just no longer in the job. Sorry, Marco, you've annoyed me, but I don't wish you harm. He didn't, and Bill Blair before him, our new Minister of National Defense. There's like a super secure email distribution list the Canadian federal government uses, and the Minister of Public Safety wasn't on it. And then as we found out with Paul Bernardo, the minister's office, he wasn't even reading the emails they were getting. And now we've got NSICOP telling us that the RCMP is incapable of properly discharging their national security functions because insufficient resources plus mandate bloat. It's responsible for not enough resources to do the too many things it has been asked to do. There have been back-to-back on consecutive days this week, as yet unexplained security disruptions at Pearson International Airport in Toronto. We've had 2 Molotov cocktail attacks in Montreal, and 2 schools there have been fired on. This war is not ending anytime soon. Can we say sitting ducks?
Look, when you put it like that, Matt, maybe everything will be fine.
I used to go to the economic club and read the telecom regulation reports.
Yeah, well, now you're helping your Jewish friends buy guns.
Before COVID hit, one of the last big series of articles I did for TVO was Toronto's long-term capital plan for recreational properties within the city. And I don't mean like condos, I mean like city parks and recreation, and how there was constant demand for hockey rinks, but there was also growing demand for more diverse sports like cricket pitches and soccer fields. And
I don't want to really write or talk about Israel. It's just, I was really happy with this idea that.
What were you writing about 5 years ago?
I can't remember. I can't remember what I was writing about 2 weeks ago, Matt. I mean, it's all gone. Once it's on the page, it's.
No, that's true. People say to me sometimes, "What'd you talk about on your radio show today?" I don't
know. So what was the year 5 years ago? So I would have had
18.
quit. So I would have quit the Post. I'm sure I was writing about.
You were McLean's in CBC then. You were doing your CBC panels
and politics in the federal government. Look, I was really happy not having to ever think about Israel. Been there. Really cool place.
Or coronaviruses.
Jerusalem is an awesome city. Exactly the kind of city I like. It's like when you have ancient cities built on ancient cities built on ancient cities, but they're still active, right? So everything feels like it goes 20 kilometers into the ground. Those are my favorite kinds of cities. Jerusalem's really cool.
I was walking down a road one day, and the road was also somebody's roof.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Right? And then like all of a sudden, like a hatch pops out and a guy crawls out and he says, "Good morning." And I say, "Good morning." I look at my buddy who's a local. I'm like, "What the fuck is that?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, he probably doesn't have a front door. So he probably just pops out of his home." Yeah. And I'm like, "We're walking on some guy's home?" He goes, "Oh yeah, everything's like layered here, built on top of everything else." It was incredible.
And maybe this is also just a Canadian thing, because everything here is so freaking new and purpose built.
Yeah.
And orderly. Everything's so orderly when you go into old cities and they're just chaotic, disastrous messes. I love that. I'm just like, oh, this is so charming. Like, look at the character on that stone. Like, it blows my mind as a North American. I love it. Like Beirut. I really like Beirut. Been to Beirut. It's one of my favorite cities because it's got like this. It was the Paris of the Middle East, but when I went, it had this whole faded grandeur thing going on, and like so you would have these like Belle Epoque features, but like lichen growing up the walls. It was so cool. So cool. I really just this is not the timeline I wanted to be in.
One of my best friends, you know him too. He said to me a couple years ago, he's a fellow Trekkie, and he said to me, he said to me totally sincerely, he was not kidding. He said to me, "I feel as though like someone sat on the wrong butterfly and we're in the bad timeline."
We would not be the only ones to have had that perception.
We were supposed to be going in one direction.
We were supposed
something
to be going
happened and knocked us into
this more, the Middle East was going to be resolved. There hadn't been any violence in there for years, and like we were supposed to have our shit together on pandemics and
low interest rates and affordable houses
forever. And we were going to build things, and things were going to be better for my kids, and the world was going to get more fun because AI was going to do all the shit jobs nobody wanted to do. And so that was going to free everybody up to do more leisure, more fun stuff. And it was all going to be, it wasn't going to be okay for me personally because I had gone into journalism, and that was a mistake. That was a mistake, a bad life decision.
But in aggregate, we were doing fine.
But in the aggregate, it was going to be okay. We were all going to get more liberal and more democratic, and things were going to get, stuff was going to get cheaper, and our quality of life was
legalized gay marriage, and everybody accepted it.
Yep. And now we were going to legalize pot, and that was going to be great. We could just chill out more. Everything was going to be okay. We were at the end of history. We'd reached the terminus and gotten off the history train. And then somehow something went wrong. Something went wrong. And now we're back on the train. And the train's gone back in time 100 years. And now it's going to its inevitable conclusion again. And it's bad.
And we've seen it before.
Yeah. We've wait a minute. We've seen this train before. We recognize where this train goes.
Yeah, it feels like a Twilight Zone episode where you open a door, like you're wandering a mansion trying to find a way out. You open a door and you step back into a room you've already been in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of what it's starting to feel a little bit like that.
You know what I mean? Jen, you know what it all means?
that reality is an illusion.
No. Come on. I'm gonna
But-
do the graphic. We need a graphic.
Oh, our expectations were a problem? I'm
Yeah.
gonna get a mug for you. Maybe we should do our year-end
Our annual
mugs.
mug.
Yeah, an annual mug again. We hadn't done that
It
in
could just
last
be
year.
it. The mug could just be your expectations were a problem on one side, and the other side we could do graphics of just all the stuff that went fucking weird.
Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. Anyway, on that happy existential crisis,
Have a great weekend, everybody.
have a great weekend. Subscribe to the line. And tell all your
Like,
friends.
subscribe. Yeah. Thanks, Jen.
All your friends.